Walter Miller seemed to have lost everything after the accident. He was overwhelmed with despair and no longer had a reason to live. Yet, with just a small act of kindness from his friends, he found the strength to keep going. Let's see what came into his life next. Walter Miller had always thought of himself as a simple man, a carpenter by trade, a husband by choice, and a father by the grace of something bigger than himself. For nearly 40 years, he had lived in the same white farmhouse tucked away at the edge of Maplewood, a small town where the summers were sweet and the winters cruel but beautiful. Then came the accident. One cold November evening, a patch of black ice on the highway took more from Walter than he could ever say aloud. His wife, Margaret, and their grown son, Peter, were gone in the blink of an eye. Just like that, Walter's world, once filled with laughter and love, collapsed into an unbearable silence. In the months that followed, the old farmhouse became a shell of its former self, much like Walter. Dust settled on the dining room table that once hosted Sunday dinners. The clock in the hallway ticked louder than it ever had before, each second a sharp reminder that life went on, whether he wanted it to or not. Friends stopped by at first, casseroles in hand, sympathy on their faces. But even the most well-meaning people eventually returned to their own busy lives. Walter understood. People moved forward. That was the way of things. But for Walter, moving forward felt like betrayal. He spent most of his days sitting in the wooden rocking chair by the window, staring out at the empty fields, remembering. Sometimes he would talk out loud, pretending Margaret was still in the kitchen humming while Peter tinkered with the old pickup truck in the barn. Nights were the hardest. Sleep didn't come easy anymore, and when it did, it was full of dreams that made waking up feel like drowning. He might have withered away completely if not for his friends, a stubborn group of old men who had shared everything from fishing trips to poker nights with him over the years. They saw what was happening to Walter, and one chilly afternoon, they showed up on his doorstep with something bundled in a worn flannel blanket. "Thought you could use some company," said Earl, the oldest of the group, his voice rough with emotion. Walter frowned, suspicious. "What the hell is that?" The bundle wiggled and let out a soft whine. Walter leaned closer and found himself staring into the wide, trusting eyes of a golden retriever puppy. Walter protested, of course. "I don't need a damn dog," he said, arms crossed firmly over his chest. "I'm too old for this nonsense." But Earl and the others wouldn't hear it. They dropped the puppy and a bag of supplies on the floor, and left with nothing more than a wave and a few muttered good lucks. The puppy, a squirming, clumsy little thing with oversized paws, sat in the middle of the living room floor looking both terrified and hopeful. Walter stared at it, his heart a battlefield between anger and something softer he hadn't felt in months. "You and me ain't gonna get along," Walter said gruffly, pointing a weathered finger at the pup. The dog, unfazed, wagged its tail and stumbled toward him. Walter sighed and looked toward the ceiling, muttering, "Margaret, if you're watching, don't you dare laugh." He didn't plan on keeping the dog. He'd feed it, maybe name it something stupid, and once it got bigger, find it a good home. That was the plan. But plans, Walter soon realized, had a way of changing when life decided otherwise. The first night, the puppy, who Walter half-heartedly named Buddy, cried in the kitchen, the sound piercing through the house's cold, still air. Walter grumbled, cursed, and finally gave up, dragging an old blanket next to his rocking chair and letting Buddy curl up at his feet. The little body breathing softly beside him was the first real warmth Walter had felt in months. In the days that followed, Buddy chewed up a pair of Walter's work boots, knocked over the trash can twice, and nearly pulled the curtains down trying to catch a moth. Walter found himself yelling more than he had in years, but he also found himself laughing. Real, aching, gut-deep laughter, and every evening, without fail, Buddy would climb into Walter's lap, no easy feat as the dog grew, and rest his head against Walter's chest, as if to say, "You're not alone anymore." Walter still missed Margaret and Peter with an ache that never truly went away. But the pain began to lose its sharp edges, softened by the simple, stubborn presence of a creature who loved him without question. By spring, Buddy had transformed from an awkward puppy into a strong, energetic dog who demanded attention, long walks, and the occasional stolen sandwich. Walter, to his own amazement, adjusted. Morning started with a brisk walk down the old dirt road, Buddy tugging eagerly at the leash, nose to the wind. Neighbors started waving again. Some even stopped to chat. Walter found himself telling stories, not the sad ones, but the good ones about Margaret's stubborn streak or Peter's first fishing trip. In the afternoons, Walter worked in the garden he had once let grow wild. Buddy would romp through the rows of tomatoes and peppers, occasionally digging where he shouldn't. But Walter couldn't find it in himself to be angry. Every overturned row was another reminder. Life was still messy, still chaotic, and still worth living. Sundays, Walter found himself back at the old community church, Buddy waiting patiently outside on a shady patch of grass. And every evening, just as the sun dipped below the fields, Walter would sit in his rocking chair, Buddy lying across his feet, and he would talk about nothing and everything. Sometimes he swore he could feel Margaret and Peter listening, their laughter carried on the warm summer breeze. It wasn't a perfect life. Grief still visited, uninvited and sharp, on quiet days or rainy nights. Sometimes Walter would wake from dreams where Margaret called his name, and he'd sit for hours in the dark. But he pressed against him like a living shield against the loneliness. But there was peace now, too, and hope. Walter was learning that healing wasn't about forgetting, it was about finding room in his heart for both the love that had been lost and the love that remained. One evening, nearly a year after Buddy first arrived, Walter sat on the front porch, a glass of sweet tea in hand, Buddy snoring gently at his side. The fields were painted gold by the setting sun, and the air smelled like rain and fresh-cut hay. A pickup truck rumbled down the road and pulled into the driveway. Earl and a few others climbed out, carrying fishing poles and coolers. "You ready, old man?" Earl called out. "Got a spot with your name on it down at the lake." Walter chuckled and stood, his joints protesting. Buddy scrambled to his feet, tail wagging wildly. "Yeah," Walter said, feeling a smile stretch across his face. "Yeah, I'm ready." They piled into the truck, Buddy riding shotgun, tongue lolling out the window. As the farmhouse grew smaller in the distance, Walter realized something. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't leaving behind a house full of memories. He was leaving behind a home, a real one full of life, love, and second chances. The road stretched out ahead, winding and unknown. But with Buddy by his side and the laughter of friends ringing in the warm air, Walter knew he'd be just fine. Maybe life hadn't ended after all. Maybe it was just beginning again. Grief is a road we never choose to walk, but when it finds us, we must learn how to keep moving one small step at a time. A place called home reminds us that healing doesn't come from forgetting the past, but from finding new reasons to wake up each day, even if they come in unexpected forms, like a clumsy puppy with a big heart. This story teaches that love doesn't end with loss, it changes shape. And even when we feel broken beyond repair, life has a quiet way of offering second chances, often through the simplest acts of companionship, kindness, and connection. Whether it's a friend who won't give up on us or a dog who sits quietly beside us through the dark, there is always a path forward. In the end, it's not about getting back the life we had. It's about building something new, brick by brick, memory by memory, and learning that peace, joy, and purpose can still be found, even after heartbreak. Sometimes, the smallest presence can help us rediscover the strength to live again.